Emily Hartman gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as her car climbed the narrow, winding road up the mountain. The late afternoon sun was already dipping behind the peaks, casting long, eerie shadows over the dense forest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The last time she'd been this close to St. Elmo's Asylum, she was just a teenager visiting her brother. Now she was a 35-year-old psychiatrist, and the weight of the years between then and now pressed heavily on her. "All right, Emily, you can do this," she muttered to herself, glancing at the old map spread out on the passenger seat. She'd printed it from an ancient archive online, its faded lines barely readable. GPS signals were non-existent this far into the mountains, and her phone had lost service miles back. As she rounded the final bend, the asylum came into view. The sight took her breath away, not in a good way. The once grand institution now stood in ruins, its once white walls charred and blackened from the fire. The windows were shattered, gaping like empty eyes, and the iron gate hung askew, creaking ominously in the breeze. "Here goes nothing," she said, pulling her car to a stop just outside the gate. She grabbed her flashlight and the old patient record she'd brought along. Her brother's name, Michael Hartman, was scrawled on the top file. Just seeing it made her heart clench. The gate screeched as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. She stepped through, the gravel crunching under her boots. Every step felt like walking back in time. Memories flooded her mind. Michael's bright smile, his laughter, and then the last time she'd seen him, lost, confused, and begging her to believe him. Inside the asylum grounds, nature had begun to reclaim the land. Weeds and vines snaked their way through cracks in the pavement, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. The main building loomed ahead, a monolith of forgotten nightmares. Emily took another deep breath and headed towards the entrance. The heavy wooden doors were still intact, though one hung precariously on a single hinge. She pushed it open with a loud groan, stepping into the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the beams of her flashlight, and the smell of burnt wood was overpowering. She walked down the main hallway, her flashlight revealing remnants of the past. Rusted wheelchairs, broken gurneys, and faded posters on the walls promoting outdated mental health practices. It was as if the place had been frozen in time since the fire. Reaching the old records room, Emily pushed open the door. It was a small victory that the room had survived the fire relatively unscathed. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers hanging open and contents scattered on the floor. She knelt down, rifling through the papers until she found what she was looking for, her brother's file. "Here you are, Michael," she whispered, flipping it open. His smiling face stared back at her from an old photograph taken during better times. She traced his image with her finger, her heart aching with longing. As she scanned the records, her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows around the room. She paused, listening. The silence was thick, almost tangible. But then, she heard it, a faint whisper, like someone calling her name. She spun around, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. The sound of her own voice was almost shocking in the silence. There was no answer, only the creaking of the old building settling. Emily shook her head, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. "Get it together, Emily," she muttered. She had a job to do, find out what happened to her brother and why he disappeared. Gathering her courage, she stood up and tucked the file under her arm. As she walked back into the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to move just out of her line of sight, and that whispering sound persisted, growing louder with each step. She headed deeper into the asylum, towards the old patient rooms. Each door she passed seemed to hold its own secrets, its own horrors. But she kept going, driven by the need for answers. Her brother's face, his voice haunted her every step. Just a little further, she told herself, pushing open another door. This room was larger, with broken beds and shattered glass everywhere. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and in the corner she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A child's toy, a small teddy bear, burnt and discarded. Emily knelt down, picking up the bear. It was a simple toy, something that must have belonged to one of the young patients. Holding it made her feel connected to the past, to the people who had lived and suffered here. She placed it back gently, a silent promise to remember them. As she stood, a sudden chill ran down her spine. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the whispering was now unmistakably clear. It was her name, repeated over and over. Emily, Emily, Her flashlight flickered again, and in the beam of light she saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a man, his features obscured by shadow, but she recognized the outline. It was Michael. "Michael," she cried, taking a step forward, but as quickly as he appeared he vanished, leaving only the darkness and the echo of her voice. Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them away angrily. "I'll find you, Michael. I promise," she whispered to the empty room. With renewed determination, Emily turned and headed towards the heart of the asylum, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. She was here for answers, and nothing, not even the restless spirits of the past, would stop her from uncovering the truth. Emily parked her old sedan at the edge of the crumbling driveway, the engine sputtering to a stop. She took a deep breath, staring up at the imposing facade of St. Elmo's Asylum. The once grand entrance was now a gaping maw of decay, the doors hanging off their hinges. A shiver ran down her spine as she grabbed her flashlight and pushed the car door open. "All right, Emily, you've got this," she whispered to herself, trying to muster up some confidence. The front steps creaked ominously under her weight. Emily hesitated at the threshold, peering into the darkness beyond. She flicked on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, and the air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. "Great, just like a horror movie," she muttered, stepping inside. The lobby was a mess of overturned furniture, shattered glass, and scattered papers. The walls were stained with years of neglect, peeling paint revealing the brickwork underneath. Emily moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. She aimed her flashlight at the receptionist's desk, noticing a stack of yellowed files. She approached the desk, brushing off the dust to read the labels. Most of them were mundane, supply orders, maintenance logs, but one caught her eye, patient records. She picked it up, flipping through the brittle pages. "Come on, where are you?" she murmured, searching for any mention of her brother, Daniel. A sudden noise made her jump, a clattering sound coming from down the hall. She froze, straining to listen. The silence was deafening. After a moment, she shook her head. "Calm down, it's just an old building settling." Trying to steady her nerves, she continued her search, moving deeper into the asylum. The hallways were even darker, the flashlight beam revealing graffiti on the walls and more debris littering the floor. She reached the patient wards, the doors to the rooms hanging open like gaping mouths. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't expect an answer, but the silence was unsettling. She stopped at one room, her brother's name scratched into the metal plaque. The sight of it made her heart ache. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, with a rusted bed frame and a broken chair. Papers and old belongings were strewn across the floor. Emily knelt down, rifling through the scattered items. She found an old notebook, the cover worn and pages filled with scribbled notes. It was Daniel's handwriting. She sat on the floor, flipping through the pages, her eyes scanning the familiar scrawl. "Dr. Crowley, procedures. They won't stop," she read aloud, her voice trembling. The notes were fragmented, but they painted a picture of fear and desperation. A cold draft blew through the room, causing her to shiver. She stood up, hugging the notebook to her chest. She had to find out more about Dr. Crowley and what had happened here. Determined, she left the room, heading towards the old records room she had seen on the asylum's blueprint. As she walked, the building seemed to come alive around her. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a whisper, a reminder of the lives that had been confined within these walls. She reached the records room, the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she was greeted by rows of filing cabinets, some toppled over, others still standing. She started sifting through the files, pulling out anything related to Dr. Crowley. The man had been a controversial figure, his methods unorthodox and his demeanor reportedly cold and detached. As she read through the documents, she felt a growing sense of unease. This guy was seriously messed up, she said to herself, shaking her head. A sudden thump echoed from the hallway, louder this time. Emily's heart raced as she spun around, her flashlight beam trembling. The air grew colder, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow darting past the doorway. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. There was no reply, only the oppressive silence. "Okay, Emily, you're just freaking yourself out. Focus." She took a deep breath and returned to the files. Among them, she found an old tape labeled Experiment 43, Patient DH. Her hands shook as she picked it up, recognizing her brother's initials. There was an old tape player on a nearby shelf, covered in dust. She wiped it off and inserted the tape, pressing play. The recording crackled to life, the distorted voice of Dr. Crowley filling the room. Emily listened, her heart sinking with every word. Crowley described the procedures in clinical detail, his tone detached and almost gleeful as he spoke of pushing patients to their limits. Patient DH is showing signs of severe distress, but the results are promising, Crowley's voice echoed. We must continue, despite his resistance. Emily felt tears prick at her eyes. Her brother had suffered terribly, and Crowley had shown no mercy. She was determined to bring the truth to light, to expose the horrors that had taken place within these walls. Suddenly, the tape cut off, replaced by a soft, eerie whisper. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized it wasn't coming from the tape. It was right behind her. She spun around, her flashlight flickering. The room was empty, but she felt a presence, a chilling sense of being watched. Gathering her courage, she spoke into the darkness. I'm here to find the truth about my brother. I won't leave until I do. The whispering stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. Clutching the notebook and the tape, she made her way out of the records room, ready to face the next chapter of her investigation. Emily Hartman pushed open the creaky door to what appeared to be Dr. Crowley's old office. The smell of mold and charred wood was strong, and the room was a mess of overturned furniture and scattered papers. Her flashlight beam cut through the dust particles, illuminating old medical charts and notes. All right, Crowley, let's see what secrets you've been hiding, Emily muttered to herself, stepping cautiously into the room. She sifted through the debris, her eyes scanning for anything that might provide clues about her brother's disappearance. After what felt like hours, she spotted a faint outline of a door behind a large, fallen bookshelf. Seriously? She sighed, realizing she'd have to move the heavy piece of furniture. With a grunt, she pushed and shoved until she could wedge herself through the gap. Behind the bookshelf was a small, hidden room. Emily's flashlight revealed a desk covered in old files and a dusty, antiquated TV set with a VCR. She felt a chill run down her spine. This had to be Crowley's secret lair. Jackpot, she whispered, pulling out a chair and sitting down at the desk. She rummaged through the files, quickly realizing they were patient records, meticulously kept and full of disturbing details about Crowley's methods. Emily's heart raced as she found her brother's file. She hesitated before opening it, bracing herself for whatever she might find. The file detailed her brother's treatment under Crowley's care. The notes were clinical and detached, describing experiments and methods that bordered on torture. Emily's eyes welled up with tears as she read about the electroshock sessions and sensory deprivation trials. I'm so sorry, Chris, she whispered, clutching the file to her chest. Determined to find more, she turned her attention to the stack of VHS tapes. Each was labeled with dates and patient numbers. She found a tape corresponding to the dates her brother was at the asylum and slid it into the VCR. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy image of a dimly lit room. Crowley's voice crackled through the speakers, methodically questioning a visibly distressed patient. As she watched, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Crowley's voice was cold and emotionless, his methods chillingly clinical. Emily fast-forwarded, stopping when she saw her brother on the screen. He looked gaunt and terrified, a shell of the person she remembered. Stay strong, Chris, she murmured, fighting back tears. A sudden noise behind her made Emily jump. She spun around, her flashlight beam catching the silhouette of a young woman in a hospital gown. The apparition's eyes were hollow, and her expression was one of deep sorrow. Please help us, the ghostly figure whispered before fading away. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had to keep going, for her brother and for the others who had suffered under Crowley's twisted care. Taking a deep breath, she continued to watch the tapes and read through the files, piecing together the horrifying reality of what had happened at St. Elmo's Asylum. The more she uncovered, the stronger her resolve became. She was getting closer to the truth, but she knew the worst was yet to come. Emily packed up the files and tapes, determined to take them with her as evidence. She left the hidden room, carefully closing the door behind her. The asylum seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath, waiting for what she would uncover next. As she walked down the dark hallways, the echoes of the past seemed to follow her, The faces of the patients, the cold gaze of Dr. Crowley, and the desperate plea of the apparition all weighed heavily on her mind. "We're not done yet," Emily said to herself, gripping her flashlight tighter. Not by a long shot. With renewed determination, she pressed on, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead in her search for the truth. Emily's flashlight beam cut through the thick darkness of the hallway. Her breath was shallow, each step echoing ominously in the deserted asylum. She glanced at her watch. 2:47 a.m. Great, she muttered to herself, the witching hour. She had been sifting through the old records for hours now, finding more questions than answers about her brother. Her mind kept drifting back to the strange sounds and whispers she had heard earlier. Was it just her imagination, or something more sinister? As she turned a corner, the air grew noticeably colder. Emily stopped, shining her flashlight around. The light caught on something shiny, an old ornate mirror hanging on the wall. She approached it, her reflection wavering in the cracked glass. "Just keep it together, Emily," she whispered. "You came here for answers." Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the hallway, extinguishing her flashlight. Emily fumbled with the switch, but it wouldn't turn back on. The darkness pressed in around her. She felt a chill run down her spine, her skin prickling with goosebumps. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. A faint, echoing laugh answered her. Emily's heart raced. She knew that laugh. It was the same one she'd heard on Dr. Crowley's old tapes. Her flashlight flickered back to life, revealing a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall. It was Dr. Crowley, or what was left of him. "Emily Hartman," his voice oozed through the silence. "I warned you to leave." Emily's throat went dry. She forced herself to speak. "I need to know what happened to my brother. Why did you do this to him? To all of them?" Crowley's figure seemed to shimmer, the shadows around him deepening. "They were weak, Emily. They needed to be pushed, to be broken and rebuilt. It was all for the greater good." "Greater good?" Emily scoffed, anger overtaking her fear. "You tortured them. You destroyed lives." Crowley's laughter echoed again, more menacing this time. "You can't understand, Emily, but you will. Soon enough." Emily backed away, her mind racing. She needed to get out, to regroup and figure out her next move. But as she turned, the hallway stretched infinitely, doors slamming shut one by one. The walls seemed to close in, and she felt a crushing weight on her chest. "Don't fight it, Emily," Crowley's voice whispered in her ear. "Join us." She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. "This isn't real," she muttered. "It's just in my head." When she opened her eyes again, the hallway was back to normal. Crowley was gone, but the oppressive feeling lingered. Emily knew she was in a battle not just for answers, but for her sanity. Stumbling back to the main office, she sat down heavily in a chair, her mind buzzing with fear and determination. She pulled out her notebook, jotting down everything she could remember from the encounter. "All right, Crowley," she said to the empty room. "You want to play? Let's play." Emily knew she had to dig deeper, confront the darkness head on. Her brother's fate, and perhaps her own, depended on it. Emily sat on the edge of an old, dusty bed in one of the patient rooms, her flashlight flickering weakly in the dim light. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The asylum was getting to her, and she knew it. She hadn't slept in what felt like days, and the constant whispering voices and fleeting shadows were wearing her down. "Come on, Emily, get a grip," she muttered to herself, running a hand through her tangled hair. She had to stay focused if she was going to find out what happened to her brother. But it was hard when the air itself seemed to be filled with unseen eyes watching her every move. Just as she was about to get up, she heard a noise, like a soft sobbing. It echoed down the hallway, sending chills down her spine. She grabbed her flashlight and stood up, her legs shaking slightly. She needed to check it out. She couldn't ignore anything in this place. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The sobbing continued, leading her to a door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she found herself in what looked like an old therapy room. In the corner, a shadowy figure was hunched over, shaking with sobs. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to step closer. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft and cautious. The figure lifted its head, revealing the pale, tear-streaked face of a young woman. Emily gasped. She recognized her from the old patient record she'd found. It was Sarah, a girl who had been admitted for severe depression and had never left. "Sarah?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that you?" The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "He won't leave me alone," she whispered. "He keeps hurting us." Emily's mind raced. She had read about Dr. Crowley's cruel methods, but hearing it from a ghostly patient made it all too real. "I'm going to help you," she said, trying to sound confident. "But I need you to tell me what happened." Sarah's eyes darted around the room, as if she was afraid someone would hear. "He said he could cure us, but he lied. He tortured us, played with our minds. Some of us. We never made it out." Emily felt a surge of anger. How could someone be so cruel? "I'm going to stop him," she promised, "but I need to find out what he did to my brother." "Do you know anything about him? Michael Hartman?" Sarah's face went blank for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "He was one of the last. Crowley. He was obsessed with him. Said he was special." Emily's heart ached. Her brother had always been different, always struggling with his own demons. "Do you know where I can find any records or clues about what he did to Michael?" Sarah pointed to a door at the back of the room. "There's a hidden room behind that door. Crowley kept all his notes there." "Thank you, Sarah," Emily said, squeezing the girl's cold hand. "I promise I'll help you all find peace." As she moved towards the door, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. She turned to see Sarah fading away, her expression one of sadness and relief. Emily swallowed hard, pushing the door open to reveal a small, cluttered office. Papers and old medical files were scattered everywhere. She began rifling through the documents, her flashlight flickering ominously. The more she read, the more she felt her sanity slipping. Detailed notes about the experiments, the cruel methods, and the twisted justifications filled the pages. It was worse than she had imagined. Suddenly, the room felt darker, and the air grew heavier. Emily looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Dr. Crowley stood in the doorway, his eyes burning with a malevolent light. "You're meddling in things you don't understand," he hissed. "Leave now, while you still can." Emily stood her ground, her hands shaking. "I'm not leaving until I find out what happened to my brother." Crowley's form flickered, his face contorted with rage. "Then you'll join them. All of them." The room began to spin, shadows dancing around her. Emily fought to stay conscious, clinging to the edge of the desk. She couldn't let him win. She had to stay strong, for her brother, for Sarah, for all the lost souls trapped in this nightmare. As the darkness closed in, Emily made a desperate grab for the last file on the desk. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. Emily sat on the cold, cracked floor of Dr. Crowley's old office, the air thick with dust and memories. The hidden room she'd discovered was filled with records, but one in particular, a leather-bound diary, caught her eye. She opened it, her hands trembling slightly. "Let's see what dark secrets you kept, Crowley," she muttered to herself, flipping through the yellowed pages. The diary started innocuously enough, detailing mundane daily activities and patient observations. But as she read on, the entries grew darker, more twisted. Crowley had documented his experiments with a clinical detachment that made Emily's skin crawl. Entry: January 15, 1978, Subject 12 exhibited signs of extreme agitation. Administered higher dose of Compound X. Observed reactions with keen interest. Subject's screams were enlightening. Emily shuddered, imagining her brother among the subjects. Her eyes scanned the pages until she found a familiar name. Entry: March 2, 1985, patient, Daniel Hartman. Subject showed promise. Pushed further with sensory deprivation and hallucinogenic treatments. Results were mixed. Continued observation necessary. She felt a lump form in her throat. "Daniel," she whispered, her heart aching. Her brother had been reduced to a mere experiment, a subject in Crowley's cruel game. As she delved deeper, the entries became more frantic, more obsessive. Entry: August 19, 1987. Daniel's resistance is remarkable. The hallucinations have taken a toll, yet he remains defiant. Must break him. Must understand his resilience. Emily's grip tightened on the diary, anger and sorrow mixing in her chest. She flipped to the last entry, dated the night before the fire. Entry: October 12, 1989. Daniel remains unbroken. Extraordinary. Tonight I will push him further than ever before. This could be my greatest breakthrough. Or the end? A sudden chill ran down her spine. She could almost hear Crowley's voice, a sinister whisper in the decaying room. "Emily," it seemed to call. She stood up, diary in hand, and turned to see Crowley's apparition standing by the door. His cold, dead eyes locked onto hers. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed, his voice echoing in the empty room. "Why did you do this?" Emily demanded, her voice breaking. "Why, my brother?" Crowley's ghostly form flickered, a smirk playing on his lips. He was different, stronger. I needed to understand why. Emily felt a surge of anger. "You destroyed lives. You tortured innocent people." "They were necessary sacrifices," Crowley replied coldly. "For the greater good." Emily took a step forward, clutching the diary like a weapon. "You're a monster." Crowley's form wavered, the room growing colder. "And yet, here you are, seeking answers from a monster." The room seemed to spin, and Emily struggled to keep her balance. Crowley's spirit loomed closer, his presence suffocating. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, remembering her training. "You don't control me," she whispered fiercely. "You're just a ghost, a shadow of the past." Suddenly she felt a hand on her shoulder, but it wasn't cold. She opened her eyes to see her brother Daniel, standing beside her, his face calm and reassuring. "It's okay, Emily," he said softly. "You can let go now." Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded, feeling a weight lift from her heart. She turned back to Crowley's spirit, which now looked less menacing, almost pitiable. "You're done here," she said firmly. "This ends now." With that, she closed the diary and placed it back on the dusty shelf. The room grew brighter, the oppressive weight lifting as Crowley's spirit began to fade. "Nah," he cried, but his voice was weak, desperate. "You can't do this," but it was already done. Emily felt the asylum's grip on her loosening. She turned to Daniel, who smiled sadly at her. "Thank you," he whispered before disappearing. Emily stood alone in the room, the air now calm and still. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't felt in years. It was over. She had faced the darkness and won. With a final glance at the diary, she left the room, ready to leave the asylum and its horrors behind forever. Emily sat in the darkened office, her hands trembling as she clutched Dr. Crowley's old diary. The words on the pages confirmed her worst fears. Her brother had been one of Crowley's last experiments, subjected to unthinkable horrors in the name of psychiatric advancement. She wiped a tear from her cheek, determined to end this nightmare once and for all. "All right, Crowley," she whispered to herself. "Time to put you to rest." As she stood, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The air grew thick with an oppressive presence, and she felt Crowley's eyes on her, watching from the shadows. She took a deep breath and made her way to the center of the asylum, where the worst of his experiments had taken place. Emily had read about rituals to release trapped souls, and while she wasn't entirely sure it would work, she had no other choice. She arranged the items she'd found in the asylum, a rusted scalpel, a cracked mirror, and a piece of scorched fabric, in a circle. She knelt down and began to speak the words she'd memorized from an old book she found in Crowley's office. As she chanted, the air around her began to hum with energy. The spirits of the former patients appeared, their faces a mixture of relief and fear. Crowley's ghost materialized, his eyes burning with anger. "You think you can undo my work?" Crowley hissed, his voice echoing through the decaying halls. "I think it's time you face the consequences of your actions," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Crowley lunged at her, but the circle of items flared with a bright light, forcing him back. The spirits of the patients surrounded him, their collective will overpowering his malevolent force. Crowley screamed, a sound filled with rage and desperation, before dissolving into a wisp of smoke. The building shook violently. Emily realized she had to get out, and fast. She ran through the crumbling halls, dodging falling debris and trying to ignore the ghosts still lingering in her peripheral vision. The front door was in sight, but it seemed so far away. "Come on, Emily, just a few more steps," she muttered, pushing herself to keep moving despite the exhaustion. She burst through the front doors just as the building began to collapse in on itself. She stumbled down the steps, falling onto the overgrown lawn, and turned to watch as St. Elmo's asylum finally met its end, the screams of the trapped souls fading into silence. Lying on the grass, Emily felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. She'd have found the truth about her brother, but at what cost? The horrors she'd witnessed would haunt her forever, but at least the spirits were free. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of peace. Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It was over. She had done it. She had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side. As she got up and dusted herself off, she knew she'd never be the same. But she also knew that she'd found the closure she needed. Her brother could finally rest, and so could she. Emily walked away from the ruins of the asylum, the first light of dawn breaking through the mist. It was a new day, and she was ready to face whatever came next.